In the sweltering summer of 1680, the marble corridors of Madrid's royal palace echoed with whispers that would haunt the Spanish court for generations. Behind gilded doors and beneath crystal chandeliers, a secret festered one that would ultimately bring down the most powerful dynasty Europe had ever known. This is not a tale of war or revolution, but of something far more insidious, the slow, methodical destruction of a bloodline that believed itself divinely chosen. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about royal power and the true cost of absolute authority. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled Spain for over 2 centuries, their empire stretching from the Americas to the Philippines, their wealth flowing like rivers of gold from the New World. Yet by 1680, this mighty empire was crumbling from within, poisoned by an obsession that would prove more deadly than any foreign invasion. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. Today we are going to open the doors to the sick room of the Spanish Empire. We will smell the incense burned to hide the scent of decay. We will look into the mirrors that reflected faces distorted by generations of incest. We will examine the medical reports that were sealed for centuries, revealing the biological nightmare of a family that bred itself into extinction. This is the autopsy of the House of Habsburg. The silence of the palace was not one of peace, but of a collective holding of breath, as if the entire court was waiting for the final inevitable collapse of a structure built on rotten foundations. The Spanish Habsburgs had become prisoners of their own ideology, trapped in a web of their own making where blood was considered more precious than health and purity more valuable than life itself. Princess Margarita Teresa of Spain should have been the jewel of European royalty. Born into unimaginable wealth and privilege, she was destined for greatness, her hand sought by emperors and kings across the continent. Instead, she became a living symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the Spanish royal family. Contemporary accounts describe a young woman whose very presence cleared rooms, whose condition was so disturbing that even hardened courtiers fled in disgust. The princess suffered from a medical condition so severe that no amount of perfume, no quantity of rose water, no collection of exotic remedies could mask its effects. Witnesses described an odor so overwhelming that it seemed to emanate from her very soul, a stench that spoke of internal decay and systematic collapse. This was not mere illness. This was the physical manifestation of genetic catastrophe, the result of generations of decisions that prioritized politics over biology. But Margarita Teresa was not alone in her suffering. Her brother, the future King Carlos II, would inherit not just the Spanish throne, but a body so damaged by genetic defects that he could barely function as a human being, let alone as a monarch. Together, these siblings represented the final chapter of one of history's most powerful dynasties, their very existence a testament to the devastating consequences of royal inbreeding. The Habsburg family tree had become a genetic nightmare, a twisted maze where cousins married cousins, where uncles weed nieces, and where the same diseased bloodline circulated again and again through successive generations. What had begun as a strategy to maintain political control had evolved into a systematic program of genetic destruction, turning the royal family into laboratory specimens in an experiment they didn't even realize they were conducting. This obsession with blood purity wasn't unique to Spain, but nowhere else had it been pursued with such relentless determination. The Spanish Habsburgs had taken the concept to its logical and catastrophic conclusion, creating a bloodline so concentrated, so genetically compromised, that it could no longer sustain itself. They had literally bred themselves out of existence, and in doing so, had condemned their empire to follow them into oblivion. The genealogical chart of the Spanish Habsburgs does not resemble a tree with spreading branches, but rather a tangled root system choking on itself, a visual representation of a biological dead end. The year 1680 marked a turning point not just for the Spanish royal family, but for the entire concept of dynastic rule in Europe. As Princess Margarita Teresa's condition worsened, and her brother Carlos struggled to fulfill even the most basic royal duties. Foreign courts began to circle like vultures, sensing the approaching end of Habsburg dominance. The empire that had once struck fear into the hearts of its enemies was now viewed with a mixture of pity and barely concealed anticipation. The story of royal inbreeding begins in the medieval period, when European monarchs first discovered that strategic marriages could be used to consolidate power, forge alliances, and prevent the fragmentation of kingdoms. Initially, this system worked brilliantly, allowing royal families to maintain control over vast territories while keeping wealth and influence concentrated within a small group of interconnected dynasties. The practice seemed not just logical, but divinely ordained, a way to preserve the sacred nature of royal blood. The House of Habsburg had mastered this art better than any other family in European history. Through carefully planned marriages, they had assembled an empire that spanned continents, controlling trade routes, colonial territories, and military resources on an unprecedented scale. Their motto, Bella Gerant Alii, to Felix Austria Noob, let others wage war, you happy Austria, Mary, reflected their confidence in matrimony as a tool of conquest. However, the Habsburg marriage strategy contained a fatal flaw that would only become apparent after generations of implementation. As the family's power grew, so did their isolation from other noble bloodlines. They began to see themselves as fundamentally different from other royal families, believing that their blood carried special qualities that made them uniquely suited to rule. This sense of superiority led them to increasingly restrict their marriage choices to within their own extended family. The Spanish branch of the Habsburg family, established when Charles V divided his empire between his Spanish and Austrian territories, became particularly obsessed with maintaining blood purity. Unlike their Austrian cousins, who occasionally married outside the Habsburg circle, the Spanish Habsburgs viewed any dilution of their bloodline as a betrayal of their divine mandate. This decision would prove to be their undoing. By closing their doors to the world, they essentially locked themselves in a genetic prison, turning the royal bedchamber into a chamber of horrors, where recessive genes were allowed to run rampant. By the mid-17th century, Spanish Habsburg family trees had begun to resemble closed loops rather than branching structures. Cousins routinely married cousins, and the genetic diversity that is essential for healthy offspring was systematically eliminated from the bloodline. Each generation saw an increase in birth defects, mental disabilities, and physical deformities. But rather than recognizing these as warning signs, the royal family interpreted them as tests of faith or temporary afflictions that would be overcome through prayer and medical treatment. The Spanish court physicians, bound by protocol and fearful of contradicting royal ideology, found themselves in an impossible position. They could observe the mounting evidence of genetic damage, but they dared not suggest that the royal marriage practices were responsible for the declining health of the royal family. Instead, they offered increasingly desperate treatments, from bloodletting to exotic imported remedies, all while the true cause of the problem continued unchecked. Religious authorities, too, played a role in perpetuating the cycle of destruction. The Catholic Church, deeply intertwined with Spanish royal power, provided theological justification for the Habsburg marriage practices, arguing that God had chosen this family to rule and that maintaining the purity of their bloodline was a sacred duty. Any suggestion that these marriages were harmful was treated as heresy, effectively silencing the few voices that might have warned of the approaching catastrophe. Foreign observers, particularly diplomats from rival nations, began to take note of the declining condition of the Spanish royal family by the early 17th century. Venetian ambassadors, French courtiers, and English diplomats sent detailed reports back to their governments describing the physical and mental deterioration they witnessed at the Spanish court. These accounts, preserved in diplomatic archives, provide some of our most detailed evidence of the Habsburg genetic crisis. Princess Margarita Teresa's birth in 1651 was initially celebrated as a triumph for the Habsburg dynasty. She was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, a union that exemplified the family's commitment to keeping power within their bloodline. The princess was fourth in line to the Spanish throne and was immediately recognized as one of the most eligible marriage prospects in Europe, with her potential union seen as a way to forge crucial political alliances. However, it quickly became apparent that Margarita Teresa was not the healthy, vibrant princess that the Spanish court had hoped for. Contemporary accounts describe a child who struggled with basic physical development who seemed to lack the energy and vitality expected of royal offspring. As she grew older, her condition became more pronounced, manifesting in ways that horrified even the most experienced courtiers. The most disturbing aspect of the princess's condition was the overwhelming odor that surrounded her, described by witnesses as being so intense that it could be detected from considerable distances. This olfactory assault was likely a symptom of trimethylaminoria, a rare metabolic disorder amplified by inbreeding, causing the body to excrete a pungent fish-like odor through sweat and breath. This wasn't merely poor hygiene or the result of inadequate medical care. This was something far more serious, a symptom of internal processes gone wrong. Court physicians tried everything from herbal remedies to imported spices, but nothing could mask or eliminate the stench that had become the princess's defining characteristic. The impact on court life was immediate and devastating. Social gatherings that would normally have featured the princess prominently were restructured to minimize her presence. Diplomatic receptions became exercises in careful choreography, with ambassadors and visiting dignitaries positioned as far as possible from the princess, while still maintaining the appearance of respect for royal protocol. The very architecture of court ceremonies had to be modified to accommodate her condition. Personal accounts from courtiers and servants provide heartbreaking glimpses into the princess's daily existence. She was reportedly aware of her condition and the effect it had on others, leading to increasing isolation and withdrawal from public life. The young woman who should have been at the center of Spanish high society instead found herself relegated to the margins, a painful existence that seems to have deepened her physical and emotional suffering. Marriage negotiations for Princess Margarita Teresa began early, as was customary for royal offspring, but her condition created unprecedented challenges for Spanish diplomats. Potential suitors, initially attracted by the political advantages of an alliance with Spain, withdrew their interest once they learned of the princess's health problems. This left Spanish negotiators in the impossible position of trying to arrange advantageous marriages while concealing information that would inevitably become apparent to any serious suitor. The princess's younger brother, Carlos, born in 1661, would prove to be an even more dramatic example of Habsburg genetic deterioration. From birth, it was clear that Carlos suffered from multiple severe disabilities that would affect every aspect of his life. He was unable to walk until age 4, struggled with speech throughout his life, and displayed cognitive limitations that made it difficult for him to understand even basic concepts of governance and statecraft. He was kept in swaddling clothes far longer than any other child, his frail legs hidden from view, while the court whispered that the King of Spain had to be breastfed until he was 5 years old. Carlos's physical appearance became the subject of intense speculation and barely concealed horror among European courts. The famous Habsburg jaw, a genetic trait that had become increasingly pronounced in successive generations, reached its most extreme form in Carlos. His lower jaw protruded so dramatically that he could barely close his mouth, making eating and speaking tremendously difficult. His tongue was reportedly so large that it interfered with his ability to communicate clearly, forcing him to drool uncontrollably. The young prince's condition was not limited to his facial features. Contemporary accounts describe a person of extremely small stature with a disproportionately large head and limbs that seemed unable to coordinate properly. He suffered from what appears to have been epilepsy, experiencing seizures that became more frequent and severe as he aged. His overall health was so fragile that court physicians lived in constant fear that he might die at any moment, leaving Spain without a clear heir to the throne. Mental disabilities compounded Carlos's physical problems, creating a situation that would have been tragic for any individual, but was particularly devastating for someone destined to rule one of the world's great empires. He displayed what modern medical experts would recognize as significant cognitive delays, struggling to learn basic skills and showing little understanding of the complex political and military challenges facing Spain during his lifetime. Despite these obvious limitations, Spanish court protocol demanded that Carlos be treated as the future king and prepared for his eventual role as monarch. This created a bizarre and ultimately futile educational program, as tutors and advisors attempted to teach statecraft to someone who could barely manage personal care. The contrast between the gravity of Spain's international situation and the limited capabilities of its future ruler created a sense of impending doom that permeated every aspect of court life. The broader implications of the royal family's condition extended far beyond personal tragedy. Spain was facing serious challenges from rival European powers, colonial rebellions, and economic problems that required decisive leadership and strategic thinking. Instead, the ship of state was captained by a man who spent his days playing with dwarves in the palace gardens, oblivious to the storms gathering on the horizon. Instead, the country was led by a King Philip IV, who was himself the product of inbreeding, and would be succeeded by a son whose disabilities made effective governance impossible. Foreign intelligence services began to focus intensively on the Spanish succession question. Recognizing that Carlos's inevitable death without children would create a power vacuum that could reshape the European balance of power, French, Austrian, and English diplomats cultivated networks of informants within the Spanish court seeking detailed information about the king's health and the likelihood of his producing an heir. These intelligence operations would ultimately play crucial roles in the complex diplomatic maneuvering that followed Carlos's death. The Spanish court's attempts to address the royal family's health problems revealed the limitations of 17th century medical knowledge and the dangerous intersection of politics, religion, and science. Court physicians representing the most advanced medical thinking of their time were completely unprepared to deal with genetic disorders that wouldn't be understood scientifically for another 2 centuries. Their treatments, ranging from bloodletting to exotic herbal remedies, not only failed to help, but often made the patient's conditions worse. Religious explanations for the royal family's suffering became increasingly important as medical treatments continued to fail. Spanish Catholic theology provided several frameworks for understanding physical affliction, from divine punishment for sins to spiritual tests designed to prove the family's worthiness to rule. These religious interpretations had the convenient advantage of removing any suggestion that human actions, specifically the marriage practices of the royal family, might be responsible for the crisis. Exorcism and other spiritual interventions were attempted on multiple occasions, particularly as Carlos's seizures and other neurological symptoms were interpreted as possible signs of demonic possession. The priests would chant over his convulsing body, believing they were fighting the devil when in reality they were fighting the inevitable consequences of his own DNA. These dramatic ceremonies, attended by high-ranking church officials and court dignitaries, provided public spectacles that served to demonstrate the royal family's piety while offering hope that supernatural intervention might succeed where medical treatment had failed. But the exorcisms failed. The herbs failed. The prayers failed. When Princess Margarita Teresa died in 1673 at the age of 21, her death was officially attributed to various medical causes. But contemporary observers understood that she had been a victim of the systematic genetic destruction that had been imposed on her family through generations of inbreeding. Her death removed one of the most visible symbols of Habsburg genetic decline, but it also eliminated any possibility that she might somehow produce healthy offspring who could continue the Spanish royal line. Her brother Carlos lingered on until 1700, a bewitched king whose body finally gave out at the age of 39. The autopsy report was a catalogue of horrors. A heart the size of a peppercorn, lungs, corroded intestines, rotten and gangrenous, a single testicle black as coal, and a head full of water. He was a man who should never have been born, kept alive by the sheer will of an empire that refused to let him go. The collapse of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty marked the end of an era in European history, demonstrating that even the most powerful political institutions are ultimately vulnerable to biological limitations. The royal family that had once dominated European politics was destroyed not by foreign enemies or popular revolution, but by the genetic consequences of their own marriage practices. The lessons of the Spanish Habsburg genetic crisis remain relevant in our contemporary world. Their story serves as both a tragedy and a warning, demonstrating the ultimate futility of attempting to transcend human biological limitations through political ideology and dynastic ambition. The stench that surrounded Princess Margarita Teresa was more than just a medical symptom. It was the physical manifestation of genetic collapse, the smell of an empire dying from within. Her brother Carlos's struggles to speak, walk, and think clearly were not just personal disabilities. They were symbols of the breakdown of the entire Spanish political system. In the end, the Habsburgs achieved their goal of purity. They became so pure, so refined, and so exclusive that they ceased to be compatible with life itself.